This is Business Decoded podcast with Ronnie Spellman. An informal chats with top business moguls as they share their stories of failure and success in a fun and relaxed way. Get entertained, educated, and unlock the secrets to success.
Welcome to Business Decoded with Ronnie Spellman. I am here with a new friend, the former CEO of both Blockbuster and the former CEO of 7-Eleven, Jim Keys. Jim, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
I've known, of course, of 7-Eleven forever. I grew up around 7-Eleven, and I've known of you for a really long time. So it's great to meet you in person. It's incredible to hear your background. I've watched the evolution of both those organizations forever. I was in Blockbuster all the time, by the way. It was the great place to be, to get my popcorn and my video and watch it at home. It was revolutionary at the time.
It was.
Yeah, so I'm intrigued because you've had such an amazing career and background. You've been in a position to influence not only the country, but really the world through a lot of what you've done with those two organizations. But you grew up pretty modest, from what I understand, in Massachusetts. What was that like, Massachusetts, back in that era? I spent a lot of time up there, and it's a beautiful place.
Well, as you know, you lived in Framingham, right?
Well, I had an office up there and spent a lot. It felt like living there.
Well, as you know, you get about 20 miles west of Framingham. It gets really rural really fast.
It does.
And, I laugh about the perceptions of places like Appalachia,
Right.
Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts can rival them.
And right across the border is New Hampshire.
Exactly.
So and they're part of that Massachusetts community.
Exactly. So it was not wildly unusual to grow up in a house without running water or heat or anything like that. It was really more a function of too many kids, too little money, as I don't think is unusual in America. I think
true.
a lot of families.
I think I read that about the plumbing. My family had a home in North Carolina, and we would go there in the summers, and we didn't have any locks on the door. It was a home that I think my grandfather built, and we had an outhouse. We didn't have indoor plumbing.
That's a nice part about not having anything. You don't need to lock it up.
You don't.
Right?
You
There's
don't.
nothing to protect. So,
but I can tell, I loved it. It was simple. People were people. They were genuine. They were honest, and we played hide and go seek in the cornfields out in North Carolina. So I don't know if yours was the same, but
oh yeah, we played. We used to play in my dad's junk cars. He would take the scrap metal from junk cars to sell on weekends, and as a result, we had something like 10 old, rusted out automobile shells in the yard, and my buddies would come down, and we'd have these grand adventures in the junk cars.
Oh wow!
Using your imagination, right?
That is intriguing. So, did you learn to work on cars? Was that part of the whole learning process for you?
I did. Another advantage of not having any money is when you're in high school and your car breaks down, you don't have any choice. You fix it.
Cars are hard to fix today, it seems. They're just so electronic. They're like driving computers.
They are. And literally the old days, I had an old MGB GT that I could that I drove back and forth to work. One of my first jobs. And the engine blew on it.
Oh.
And because it was a beater. It was an old beater. But I literally took it home, rented one of those little crane things,
right,
and pulled the motor. I had no idea what I was doing with it. We didn't have YouTube back in the day.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, but I managed to get a used motor from a junkyard and replace the motor myself.
How old were you at that time?
Probably 17.
Okay. Oh, are you
18? Yeah.
So that's hilarious. So at least it wasn't your dad's main car. He might not have liked the idea of you experimenting on his car.
No, that wouldn't have been a good thing.
You're a business guy, and I definitely want to talk about 7-Eleven. But I've always heard that the junk car business is a really good business to be in. If you own the land, you've had it in the family, it's not a bad proposition. So it sounds like you found it.
It's actually a great story that my best buddy in high school, he and I he was the smart kid. I was sort of the one struggling to keep up. And he was didn't have to study, aced every test. Well, he went to college, but he started working, as a kid in high school in the local junkyard.
Okay.
And they loved him. He was a really hard worker.
Right.
And he knew everything about cars. So they offered him a full-time job. He ended up dropping out of college and went to work for the junkyard.
Oh, wow.
Well, all these years later, he's still at the junkyard. He runs it today. And it's one of the largest, I should call it auto recycling
Sure.
businesses in the country, maybe the world. Has a beautiful life in the same town we grew up in. He lives on a lake, has a helicopter and a boat and a beautiful life. And I'm out here running around the world like a madman, and he's got it made.
That is incredible. I definitely still want to get to the 7-Eleven, but a lot of young people, they can't see their future per se. And they try to, I think, over-predict it, but it sounds like he had an opportunity, and he thought, well, why not? Right? He took it at a junkyard. I don't know if we help train young people to think about the idea of dropping out of college and working at a junkyard.
Well, that it's part of the challenge. Candidly, there's a narrative now that says you don't need to go to college. Just go get a job, work at the junkyard, whatever. The challenge with that is that he was an outlier. I mean, this kid was an entrepreneur. As I said, he was smarter than me in school. So did he need the traditional college track? Probably not.
Right.
He was going to be successful in whatever he did. And you take a guy like Peter Thiel, the big technology guy. He's out saying, "Don't go to school, just go learn coding." My concern with that narrative is that while college may not be for everyone, opportunity is.
Sure.
And for some of us, like me, I needed the structure of that academic experience. I could not have made it, I don't think, on my own without the breadth of knowledge that I gained from that more traditional high school and college experience.
I was with a friend of mine. I traveled out to San Diego recently and visited a couple of our military bases. And a friend of mine there was telling me his story. He owns a company now and has done really, really well. But it didn't begin that way. He dropped out of high school a month before graduation.
Wow.
Right at the end, and decided to enlist in the Marines. Then he had a very successful career in the Marines. He retired, and then he created his own business, and they're doing very, very well. But he said the same thing, that college maybe wasn't for him at that time. And he went on to get a master's as well, by the way.
Sure.
But he needed the structure and the discipline of the service.
Yes.
That was his initial college, right, being enlisted. And then it helped him to really focus and organize and build a career.
Sure.
Which is amazing.
And the service does do that. I think that the challenge is that, someone at 17, 18 years old, really they haven't seen enough of the world to know what they want to do, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of people are encouraging, specialize, be an accountant and do it. Decide you want to be an accountant in grade school, and then focus on that. Well, what if you grow up and you don't like being an accountant?
Right.
Then you don't have the flexibility to pivot.
Right.
And that's what's so important.
I agree with you. Early in my career, I received an engineering scholarship. I worked at one of the largest technology companies in the world, a company called Canon. Right out of high school, I joined the team. I was working in engineering, the manufacturing facility. But it exposed me to so much. It helped me to understand what I liked and what I didn't like long term. Now, engineering was fantastic. The company was great. But you're right, getting that world exposure just opens up your mind to so many other opportunities.
Exactly.
And then you start to define your course.
Yeah.
But tell me about your dad. It sounds like he had a huge impact. He has some great philosophies, some great understandings about education that may have influenced you.
Well, he was a very smart guy, but he dropped out. He was one of those kids that dropped out of school before even high school. He dropped out in the 6th grade.
Oh, wow.
And then ended up in the military. It was World War II.
Right.
His experience outside of our little town ended up being in Burma. He was a driver on the Burma Road and helped construct the Burma Road. But he came back with amazing stories about the Burmese people and how interesting their culture is. And he shared that fascination with me. And his attitude was, Jim, I don't know what to tell you, because it's not about, I haven't made a lot of money. I don't know what to tell you. I don't think it's about making money, but it's about freedom. You need to somehow focus on learning, because it's one thing they can't take away from you. And the more you learn, the more you can do.
Right. And
by the way, the more you learn, the more freedom you'll have, because you can travel the world. You can experience these cultures, and you don't have to be in a world war to go to other countries and understand the people and the cultures.
That's amazing, particularly in that area, because travel then isn't like travel today.
Right.
Where you can get around the world easily on Southwest or American Airlines. So for him to come back with that level of knowledge and information to share with you is just amazing.
Well, he was a curious, kind of an explorer before his time.
Okay.
He was one of these guys we would literally, as a kid, I'd jump in the car with him. We'd have the tent in the back of the car, and he would say, "Okay, left or right," and we would just drive.
I love it.
And we would drive and drive and drive and drive, and then find a place to camp and
That's
fish.
amazing.
Yeah, it was. The irony is, we didn't have money to do fancy stuff. He couldn't
Right.
afford to take me to Disneyland or anything
Right.
like that, but he could afford enough to give us the simple pleasures like camping and
Right.
fishing and doing the basic father-son things.
What's intriguing, and maybe this is how you ended up doing some of what you did, but the idea of him taking you all out and saying left or right, giving you the freedom to participate in that process, and then also not being afraid to go one way or the other. It's just an amazing lesson that you probably didn't realize what it was doing for you at the time.
I had no idea at the time.
Yeah.
And, it's little things that parents can learn that we take for granted. When I would read, and there'd be a busy household with all these kids, running around, and aunts and uncles, or, there'd be people over to this tiny little house, and I'd be sitting there reading, and he'd make a big deal of it. He'd say, "Look at Jim. He's sitting there reading a book."
Wow.
And those little signals were such an encouragement that, he thinks I'm smart.
Right.
He thinks I'm able to tune out all this noise and focus.
Which is huge validation from a father,
It's huge.
because our fathers are heroes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's pretty neat. So you ended up going to college, and from what I hear, Jim, and this might be wrong, but you worked your way through college at McDonald's and
Oh, yeah.
maybe some other jobs. What was that like for you?
Oh, yeah. Well, McDonald's flipping burgers. I ended up being a shift manager at McDonald's, which was a fabulous experience.
Amazing.
It's my first real business experience, because running a shift at McDonald's, interestingly, you've got a cash statement that you have to do, close out the cash at the
Right.
end of the night. It's almost a P&L you're putting together. You've got labor issues, workforce issues, inventory management. I had to
Right.
count cups.
Right.
And actually, it was a great precursor, because it's not a lot different than running a multi-billion-dollar corporation. It's
That's
just
true.
a matter of decimal points.
So you have to tell me about counting cups. I'll tell you this quick story, Jim. I hadn't mentioned this yet on the program. I don't think I'd intended to. My grandfather had a business, and he was absolutely like your dad, my hero. And we counted cash every night after it was a little retail business. We counted the cash every night. I can tell you, counting pennies.
Oh, yeah.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
It doesn't add up to a lot,
I
but it's
know.
a lot of counting and rolling pennies. We didn't have the fancy machines that counted for you. So counting cups sounds like it might be a similar
Oh, yeah.
task.
Well, then the worst part is when it doesn't match at the end of the day. And, you've got fewer cups than you had sales, or more cups than you had sales. And
Right.
you're like, wait a minute now, I've got to balance this. And you have to go count them all over again, right?
So from college, you went to grad school,
I
or
did.
did you work first?
No, I took a year to make a little bit of money and then go
Okay.
back. But I was trying to do a JD MBA. I had a professor intervene and
Yes.
convince me that I would be a terrible lawyer, so I should at least get an MBA with a JD. And when I applied to one of the only schools that had that program, which was Columbia University at the time, the business school accepted me and the law school waitlisted me. And so I kind of started the program in reverse by starting at the business school. Ended up with an internship. They sent me to Houston. Gulf Oil Corporation sent me to Houston
wow.
for the summer.
Part of your MBA internship.
Exactly.
Okay.
They offered me a job at the end of the summer, and I thought, my goodness, this is I need to make money. This would be great. So
Right.
I started my career with Gulf Oil Corporation, and thought I would go back to law school eventually.
Sure.
But my career kept on progressing, and
Wow.
doors kept opening, and so I never ended up going back to law school.
So now that you have a chance to really reflect, I do this often now, just looking back and think, all right, what happened? It's really like your dad. You go left or you go right. Neither one is bad,
Right.
but it takes you in one direction or another. And so they offer you that internship. But what was it after getting that internship that you think they saw in you when you look back?
It was actually a funny story. Since I didn't think they would hire me, I was not an
Right.
engineer. I was very much a non-conforming candidate. 'Cause everybody around me was an engineer in the oil business back then. So I really didn't think they would hire me for a full-time job. And I wasn't sure I wanted to be in the oil business.
Sure.
I was going to go back to school and see what my options were. And we were invited to lunch with the chairman and CEO of the company. And this is a long, long time ago.
Oh, wow.
And they brought me to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where the company's headquarters.
But how old were you at the time? You must have
gosh,
been
21,
Oh,
22.
wow. What an incredible offer.
Oh, yeah. It was a great experience to get to meet them. And we were sitting around a table with all of these interns from Harvard and Columbia and Wharton.
Right.
They had a class of, they had never really recruited interns from business schools. So we were all a little bit
interesting.
An odd, it was one of the first groups that they brought in from business schools. And so they went around the table and asked how everybody's summer was. And of course, all these kids wanting a job were saying all the right stuff, all the politically correct things. Well, I had a wonderful experience and blah, blah, blah. The corporation is fabulous. And they got to me and I said, well, let me tell you, I have heard a lot about read about this time there were aggressive raiders, Carl Icahn, T. Boone Pickens.
Right.
They were looking at these oil companies saying they were fat. They had too much expense. They weren't well run, et cetera, et cetera. And so I literally said, I'd come back from lunch and I'd walk up and down the halls and everybody's falling asleep behind their Wall Street Journal after their 2-martini lunch.
Oh, wow.
I said, I think you have a G&A opportunity, reduction opportunity.
Wow. At 21, you said that.
Yeah. And you could hear the air get sucked out of the room by everybody else that was going. There's shock that I would say something like that. But it was so true. It was truly an observation that I thought they're chairman and CEO of the company. I should share this. And so they took me aside after the lunch and they said, you're right. We know we need to cut expenses. In this culture, it's very hard to do that. This is back in the day, these jobs were very much entitled positions. You just didn't make any trouble and you'd sit in your chair for your whole career and then retire with the gold watch.
Right.
And they said, why don't you come to work for us? We'll go back, finish your MBA, and we'll offer you a full-time job working for the CFO in a little planning department that we're putting together in Pittsburgh.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
So part of the lesson there, I think, for a 21-year-old still in college is sometimes be bold but honest, maybe in your observations.
Yeah. Fearlessness is something in my book. I just put out this book called Education is Freedom. The Future is in Your Hands. And I talk a lot about fear being our biggest obstacle.
Right.
It hurts careers. It hurts companies. It causes this inertia that I've seen. And the bigger the company, the more vulnerable to that inertia.
Agreed.
So the antidote to that is to be able to deal with change and to have confidence and to have clarity, be able to be honest and truthful in your point of view. So those things got me my first job, ironically.
What's interesting about that, and I definitely want to get to 7-Eleven, and I need to have you back on the program. If you can hold up your book for a moment, I'd love to talk about your book in our next segment. But during COVID, I began speaking to small businesses, and I have my R values, the 26 points that help them operationally understand business and what they need to look for and how they need to manage. But fear was one of the items on my list as well, because during my time in the home building industry, people were operating out of fear, and their businesses were shrinking or dying because they were afraid to take that next step. And I was telling them, you have to be a little bit bold. You have to work through that fear and stay focused on your goals and objectives. And it sounds like you found that out early. But I suspect, again, that comes back to your father, because that ability to take a risk and go left or right helps reduce that fear component.
It does.
What do you have to lose?
It does. And, I give this message a lot to young people, particularly young people in urban America who think, the deck's stacked against me. I've got all these problems. My mom is, this or that, and my dad left. And what I tell them is adversity ended up being my superpower.
Absolutely.
Because when you come from nothing, what do you have to lose?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
I mean, it's not like they're going to take something from you. The more you know, as my dad used to say, they can take your house, they can take your car. They did take our house. They condemned it.
Right.
They can't take what you know.
Correct.
And so I was armed with the advantage of adversity.
Right.
And so I had no fear
That's
versus others who had a lot to lose or felt like they had a lot to lose.
So I want to come back to that in your book. So I want to talk a little about 7-Eleven, but I recently attended an event. And the theme of that discussion, all business leaders and CEOs, I met the CEO for McKesson and some other organizations. And the program topic was, is the American dream dying? And we were discussing exactly what you brought up, is how do we keep people, young people specifically, inspired by this notion that they can go off and succeed regardless of their circumstances. So I want to come back to that.
Absolutely.
Because I'd love to help the young people understand how you use that as your superpower.
Yes.
But tell me about, how did you end up at 7-Eleven?
Well, I kept dealing with change, and Gulf went through some hard times.
Right.
The activists, the Boone Pickens of the world, were right. They were struggling. I was working in the CFO's office doing analysis of acquisition candidates. We were on the top of my list in the research I was doing was City Service Corporation. Gulf ultimately made a run on City Service, tried to acquire it. But it didn't go well. Okay. And the street hurt Gulf stock. Boone Pickens then came after Gulf and said, you guys need to fix your business before you acquire anybody. And it was quite a mess. And it turned out that here's this crisis for a young professional. I thought, oh boy, there goes my career.
Right.
But it turned out that I had been working on City Service. 7-Eleven acquired the downstream of City Service.
Okay.
Because they were weakened after the acquisition attempt as well. Occidental Petroleum bought their upstream, their exploration and production, and 7-Eleven, or the Southland Corporation, bought Citgo, their downstream operations, refining and marketing. So here I was armed with all of this information that I had been working on over the last couple of years on City Service or Citgo Petroleum. One of the gentlemen from Gulf was hired by 7-Eleven to be CEO of Citgo, and he grabbed me and said, hey, Jim, come be our head of strategic planning. So at like 24 years old.
Oh, wow.
25
that early.
years old. Yeah, I was
oh my gosh,
leading strategic planning for the subsidiary of a major oil company,
what
now
an
a subsidiary of
opportunity.
7-Eleven. Yeah.
And all of that led from you being bold enough in front of the CEO to say, there's an opportunity here.
Not just that. There were two factors. It was also the ability to keep my head up when another crisis occurred.
Right.
So what I've discovered, and a big theme of the book, is that change is inevitable.
Yes.
I joined one of the 7 largest oil companies in the world, never thinking it would go away.
Right.
And yet here it was in the middle of an acquisition, and my job was in jeopardy. It turned out I just kept working harder.
Right.
I kept my head up.
Right.
It's not the change that matters. It's our response to the change that separates winners from losers.
Right. I became a certified trainer in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And one of the main principles is to control what you can control.
Exactly.
Right. And to what you're saying, your point is you can't control all the other, whether they're acquired or not, and whether your job stays or not, isn't necessarily your direct control. But what's in your control is your ability to continue to work hard and produce results.
Exactly. Exactly. That's why literally the subtitle of the book, The Future is in Your Hands.
Right.
Because it is.
It is.
Our response to change is in our control.
Right.
The change is not.
Right.
But we can determine how we're going to respond to it. And so in the course of writing the book, I stumbled on something really interesting. I never knew this. I just did it almost instinctively. And then I started researching in the book change and fear and opportunity. And I said, this is what made it possible for me to lead 2 Fortune 500 companies, because along the way, I discovered that change equals opportunity.
Right.
And here's the irony. That's the acronym CEO. Right? Is that not the job of a CEO to be able to embrace change, see the opportunity, and even in a crisis, and manage your way through it to maximize the opportunity for that entity? So I think it is such a fundamental element of leadership that recognition that change equals opportunity, and we can get through anything.
That is incredible. Did you come up with that?
I did.
That is nice.
Yeah, and then I looked it up. I was like, wow, somebody must have said this before. I Googled it. I did searches all over. I was like, oh, I've never seen this anywhere. So
That
I
is fantastic.
put it in the book, and I'm claiming it. I've coined the expression, change
I like
equals
that.
opportunity.
That I've not heard, and I've heard a lot through my career in business. Now, did you ever meet T-Bone Pickens by any chance?
Absolutely.
He is legendary.
He is. He's a fabulous guy. I have had the privilege of knowing and working with two of the largest corporate raider activists in the world, Carl Icahn and T-Boone Pickens.
That's amazing. Now, what I didn't know about T-Boone, so I'd followed his work in petroleum and natural gas, clean energy for a while. He has a few companies. I didn't know that he was really close friends with Ronald Reagan. And I believe he helped to fund the extension to the Reagan Library where they brought the Air Force One plane. But no, he's absolutely legendary in the United States and his dealings in the petroleum industry and from business as well.
Yeah, he was an amazing man. Also came from humble origins. He and I were both members of the same organization called the Horatio Alger Association.
Okay, yes.
And his background is just phenomenal. But I'd say if there was one trademark of Boone Pickens, it was fearlessness.
Right.
He was not afraid of anything.
Right.
And there's and Carl Icahn the same.
Right.
Absolutely no fear.
That's incredible. Now, how did you become CEO? At what point did you become CEO at like 25?
No. It took a couple more years, but again, crisis occurred. I get to 7-Eleven. The oil business was doing great. We ended up selling to PDVSA, the government of Venezuela, Citgo Petroleum, but we kept a supply contract. So 7-Eleven asked me to stay and lead the gasoline business. So I went from, and this is typical of my career, I went from financial side or planning side to then operating side, and then eventually back to the financial side because 7-Eleven had done a leveraged buyout. So they were trying to take themselves private.
Okay.
And their timing could have been worse. Timing has been figured prominently in my career.
Right.
They were doing this just as Black Monday occurred and the markets collapsed. I don't know if you remember.
I do.
Terrible timing. They proceeded with the transaction and ended up with $4 billion of debt at 17% interest.
Okay.
Yeah, and so it was a matter of time. By 1991, 7-Eleven was bankrupt.
Wow.
So here we are in bankruptcy court again. My career is in jeopardy. Everybody was saying, Jim, leave. 7-Eleven's going away.
Right.
They're irrelevant today. I chose to stay. I actually met with the CEO of the company, who was the son of the founder.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he reminded me that their business wasn't beer and soft drinks. Their
Right.
business was convenience.
Correct.
And that business was never going to go away.
Right.
But he challenged me, stay with us, but find things people need conveniently. Help us transform this company and keep it changing. And of course, I embraced that. I thought, okay, change. I got that.
Right.
I can do that. And so I stayed. And it turned out that change equaled opportunity, both for me and for the company. For me, we ended up coming out of bankruptcy, and I was again now asked to be head of strategic planning for all of the Southland Corporation, 7-Eleven.
Okay.
And eventually that job led to CFO, which allowed me to refinance the company's balance sheet, then chief operating officer, and then chief executive officer. So
It's amazing.
change was great for me as an individual, but it turned out it was great for the company because that need to restructure forced us to revisit our true mission, which was delivering on convenience, where customers want it, when, and how they want it, and bring new products in. So the company now has 80,000 stores.
Wow.
So we went from nearly going away in 1991 to today having 80,000 stores worldwide.
Yeah, that's amazing. Your brand recognition is up there with all the other major brands from a recognition standpoint, the McDonald's and the Starbucks. And so what you helped to seed out of that bankruptcy sounds like it worked well. Incredible.
It was a fabulous experience. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have participated in it. And it is such a good example for individuals and for corporations to recognize that even the most devastating change that occurs can end up being a tremendous opportunity, both personally and professionally.
And to you, another quick connection to 7-Eleven, to my family. So that same grandfather that had a couple of businesses, he had a good friend that was a bricklayer. And they built a lot of these 7-Elevens in my hometown. And so my father, as a young man, worked laying bricks for the 7-Elevens. And so just a few years ago, I was traveling with my uncle, my father's brother, and he was showing me some of the 7-Elevens that he had to build.
Yeah. Some of them have been repurposed over the years.
They're now something else.
Yeah.
But no, just an interesting connection to our family. So how did you leave to go to Netflix? And not Netflix, but I know.
That was a Freudian slip. Wow.
The Blockbuster.
At least I didn't say that.
That was all.
We sold 7-Eleven to the largest licensee, and a lot of people don't understand why in the world did you sell the company to 7-Eleven Japan. Well, they were so successful in Japan that they also had limited growth. How many more 7-Elevens? They had one on every corner in Japan practically. They very much wanted to develop China, and the Chinese government had come to me here in Dallas in the late 90s to ask us to go to China, which was very unusual.
Right.
Most American companies were begging to get into the country. And so we began putting stores in China, and the Japanese licensee really wanted it for themselves. Well, I had a Taiwanese licensee, a licensee from Thailand, from Korea. They all wanted part of China. So the Japanese licensee actually bought the company, came to us with a very favorable offer to buy the company primarily because they wanted the rights to develop China, which they then did.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And
so that gave me the opportunity to step back and say, okay, I'm still a relatively young guy. What do I want to do?
Right.
And I wanted to put those tools that I had learned about dealing with change and using technology, especially to enhance or to accelerate change. I wanted to put that to work, and Blockbuster was really a fabulous target for that opportunity.
All right, so we're at the end of our program, but that, to me, that transition from one really large operation, great brand recognition, to another one. A lot of CEOs, they might have one good run at an organization, but there was a young executive at Boeing that went to Ford during the housing crisis, and recently the CEO of Chipotle went to Starbucks.
Right.
And that is really unusual for the most part. So what you did and achieved going from one to the other as a CEO is just incredible.
It is. It's an interesting opportunity. But, a lot of people question, why did I want to go to Blockbuster first, and then was I the right fit for Blockbuster? Right. But if you think about the Blockbuster business, it was not about renting DVDs.
Correct.
It was about convenient access to media entertainment.
Very true.
Very natural transition, which we accomplished by creating a digital entity. We had streaming. A lot of people forget that. We had something called Total Access, so you could go to stores, buy mail, kiosks, or streaming. Right. So we really had a very good business model. But again, change occurred. Financial crisis of 2008.
Right.
$1 billion of debt. Sounds like a familiar song, right? So I had experience with it. Once again, had to pivot from transforming the company to saving the company, which we successfully did.
That's amazing. So I'd love to hear more about it. I want to invite you back to the program again. I want to talk about your book. I'd love to talk more about that transition and how you saved 7-Eleven, and then how you went on to save and grow and change and evolve Blockbuster during that era, and then face another crisis.
Sure.
But it's been a pleasure having you.
Well, thank you. And if your listeners want to learn more, the 7-Eleven story and the Blockbuster story and more are all captured here in Education is Freedom.
We're going to talk about it in our next program. Perfect. Thank you for joining Business Decoded with Ronnie Spellman.
Thank you for listening to Business Decoded podcast with Ronnie Spellman. Please be sure to subscribe and share, and stay tuned for more incredible Business Decoded episodes.